There was a time, I think it was at Harvard, though it may have been earlier, during those years at the Ethical Culture School, when I was first learning that the world contained not only paintings and poetry, but also laws that could not be broken by any amount of cleverness or wealth or desire, when I encountered for the first time the idea that there are things the universe simply will not permit. Not because of any prohibition imposed from outside, not because of any divine commandment or human legislation, but because of something deeper, something woven into the fabric of reality itself, something that cannot be circumvented or appealed or bargained with. I am speaking of the Second Law of Thermodynamics, and I should like to think a little about what it means, not merely as a statement of physics, which it is, and which is precise and beautiful and merciless, but as a statement about the nature of the world we live in, and about the nature of the hopes we bring to it, and about the distance between what we wish were true and what is. The second law can be stated in many ways. Rudolf Clausius, who first gave it its modern formulation in 1850, put it thus: "Heat cannot of its own accord pass from a colder to a warmer body." This sounds modest. It sounds almost trivial. A statement about the behavior of heat, about the direction in which thermal energy flows when two bodies are placed in contact. But within this modest statement lies something vast, something that governs not only the behavior of steam engines and refrigerators, but the aging of stars, the rusting of iron, the decay of civilizations, the inevitable dissolution of every ordered structure in the universe, including, one must note with what I hope is appropriate gravity, ourselves. Lord Kelvin, William Thomson, gave a different formulation around the same time. It is impossible to construct a device that operates in a cycle and produces no other effect than the conversion of heat extracted from a single reservoir entirely into work. This is the death sentence for every perpetual motion machine of the second kind. Every device that claims to extract unlimited useful energy from the heat of the ocean, the warmth of the atmosphere, the thermal energy of the earth itself. And there have been many such claims. The United States Patent Office, I am told, receives them regularly. Ingenious devices, often accompanied by elaborate diagrams and earnest explanations, each one purporting to have found the loophole that Clausius and Kelvin and Boltzmann and Planck all somehow missed. They have not found it. The loophole does not exist. It cannot exist. And the reason it cannot exist is not a matter of engineering. It is not that we have not yet been clever enough, but a matter of the deepest physics we know, a statement about the statistical behavior of matter at the most fundamental level. Let me be precise about this. Ludwig Boltzmann, who worked in Vienna and Munich and Graz in the latter half of the 19th century, a man of enormous physical bulk and equally enormous intellectual power, who suffered from depression and ultimately took his own life in 1906 at Duino, near Trieste, in circumstances that remain painful to contemplate. Boltzmann understood something that transformed our comprehension of the physical world. He understood that the macroscopic properties of matter, temperature, pressure, entropy, are not fundamental quantities. They are statistical quantities. They describe the average behavior of unimaginably large numbers of particles. A cubic centimeter of air at room temperature and atmospheric pressure contains approximately 2.7 times 10 to the 19th molecules, 27 billion molecules, each moving with its own velocity, each colliding with its neighbors billions of times per second, each obeying Newton's laws of motion with perfect fidelity. And what Boltzmann showed, in a feat of intellectual courage that was not appreciated in his lifetime, that was attacked by the most distinguished physicists of his era, that contributed, one cannot help but suspect, to the despair that ended his life. What Boltzmann showed was that entropy is a measure of the number of microscopic arrangements that correspond to a given macroscopic state. His famous formula, which is carved, and rightly so, on his tombstone in the Zentralfriedhof in Vienna, relates the entropy of a system to the logarithm of the number of microstates consistent with the observed macroscopic properties. The entropy of a system is proportional to the logarithm of its multiplicity. The constant of proportionality is Boltzmann's constant, 1.38 times 10 to the negative 23 joules per Kelvin, a number as fundamental to our understanding of the thermal world as the speed of light is to our understanding of space and time. And what this means, what it means in plain language, if plain language can be applied to something so deep, is that the second law of thermodynamics is not a law in the same sense as Newton's second law of motion or Maxwell's equations of electrodynamics. It is not a statement about what must happen in every individual case. It is a statement about what is overwhelmingly, crushingly, astronomically likely to happen when you are dealing with systems composed of vast numbers of particles. A gas expands to fill its container not because some force pushes it outward, but because there are incomparably more ways for the molecules to be spread throughout the volume than there are for them to be huddled in one corner. The ratio is not 10 to 1 or 1,000 to 1. It is 10 to the power of 10 to the 23rd to 1, a number so large that calling it astronomical is an insult to astronomy. The probability that a gas, having expanded to fill a room, will spontaneously contract back into one corner is not zero. It is merely so small that if you waited for a time equal to the age of the universe, approximately 13.8 billion years, multiplied by the age of the universe, multiplied again and again, an inconceivable number of times, you would still, in all probability, be waiting. This is why perpetual motion machines fail. Not because of friction, though friction is real and contributes, and any honest engineer must account for it. Not because of air resistance or imperfect bearings, or the 100 other practical obstacles that the inventors of these machines believe they have overcome. These are symptoms, not the disease. The disease, if one may call so beautiful a truth a disease, is entropy. Every process that converts energy from one form to another, every engine that does work, every machine that moves, all of them, without exception, increase the total entropy of the universe. Some energy is always degraded, converted from a concentrated, useful form into the diffuse, tepid warmth of the environment, from which it cannot be recovered without the expenditure of still more energy. This is not a limitation of our technology. This is a feature of reality. I should tell you about the history of this particular human folly, because the history illuminates something about the relationship between desire and truth that I think is worth examining. The dream of perpetual motion is very old, older than thermodynamics, older than physics as a discipline. In the 13th century, Villard de Honnecourt drew a wheel with hammers attached to its rim, designed to be forever overbalanced, forever turning. It does not work, of course, and it cannot work. But the drawing survives in a notebook in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, testament to the enduring human conviction that the universe owes us something for free. Leonardo da Vinci studied overbalanced wheels and concluded, correctly, with a clarity that was 2 centuries ahead of his time, that they could not work. Against the irreversible verdict of time, he wrote, I paraphrase, no mechanical contrivance can prevail. And yet the designs continued. They continued through the 17th century, the 18th, the 19th. They continue now. I have seen proposals, some from people of considerable intelligence and education, for devices that would violate the second law, that would extract work from a single heat reservoir, that would reverse the flow of entropy, that would give us something for nothing. They are always wrong. They are wrong not because the inventors are stupid, some of them are remarkably clever, but because they are in rebellion against a truth they do not wish to accept. And here, I think, one arrives at something more interesting than the physics alone. Interesting and troubling, and worth sitting with for a moment. The question is, why do we want perpetual motion so badly? Why does the stream persist, century after century, long after the physics has rendered a clear and unambiguous verdict? And I think the answer is that the dream of perpetual motion is not really about machines at all. It is about us. It is about the deep, perhaps ineradicable human desire to believe that loss is not real, that decline can be reversed, that the arrow of time can be turned around, that we can have without paying, that we can act without consequence. It is, in short, the desire to escape the second law, not merely in the mechanical sense, but in the existential sense, to escape the fact that everything runs down, that order decays into disorder, that the universe is moving with a patience and a certainty that nothing can deflect toward a state of maximum entropy, what the physicists of the 19th century called, with a melodrama that was perhaps forgivable given the magnitude of what they had discovered, the heat death of the universe. The optimist thinks this is the best of all possible worlds. The pessimist fears it is true. And the second law of thermodynamics suggests, with the quiet authority that only a fundamental law of physics can muster, that the pessimist has the better case, at least in the long run. But, and here one must be honest, because honesty about these matters is not easy and not comfortable, but it is necessary, there is another side to this. The second law tells us that the entropy of a closed system always increases. But we, human beings, living organisms, civilizations, are not closed systems. We are open systems. We exist by taking in energy from our environment, ultimately from the sun, which radiates energy at a temperature of approximately 5,800 Kelvin, and receives it back from the earth at approximately 255 Kelvin, and using that flow of energy to create and maintain local pockets of order, local decreases in entropy, which we call life. Life does not violate the second law. No one who understands the second law has ever claimed that it does. Life is consistent with the second law because the local decrease in entropy within a living organism is more than compensated by the increase in entropy of its surroundings, the heat it radiates, the waste it produces, the disorder it creates in the wider world, while maintaining its own exquisite internal order. Erwin Schrödinger understood this. In his remarkable little book, What is Life?, published in 1944, written during his exile in Dublin, a book that influenced an entire generation of biologists, including Watson and Crick in their pursuit of the structure of DNA. Schrödinger argued that a living organism maintains itself by feeding on negative entropy, by continuously extracting order from its environment. The phrase negative entropy is not quite right. Schrödinger himself acknowledged this, but the insight is profound. Life is a process by which the second law is locally and temporarily circumvented, not violated, never violated, but circumvented, by coupling the creation of order in one place to the creation of even greater disorder somewhere else. And this process, this constant, delicate, energetically expensive maintenance of order against the tide of entropy, is what makes every living thing, from the simplest bacterium to the most complex human brain, a kind of miracle. Not a miracle in the supernatural sense, I do not use the word that way, but a miracle in the precise scientific sense of something extraordinarily improbable that is sustained moment by moment by the continuous expenditure of energy. And yet, and this is perhaps the hardest thing to say, because it touches on something that I have spent much of my life struggling with, the second law ultimately wins. Not today, not tomorrow, but on a time scale that is long even by the standards of cosmology, the second law wins. The sun will exhaust its hydrogen fuel in approximately 5 billion years, expand into a red giant, and eventually cool into a white dwarf. The stars will go out, one by one. The galaxies will drift apart as the expansion of the universe accelerates. And in the very far future, 10 to the 100th years perhaps, even the protons that make up the nuclei of atoms may decay, leaving a universe of nothing but photons and leptons, drifting through an ever-expanding, ever-cooling void. This is the heat death. Not a dramatic conflagration, not a bang, but a whisper, a slow fading, an asymptotic approach to perfect uniformity and perfect stillness. Maximum entropy. Zero information. The end of all structure, all complexity, all possibility of anything that could be called experience or thought or meaning. I have been wrong about many things. I was wrong as a young man to believe that physics was a refuge from the messiness and pain of human life, that the clean precision of equations could protect one from the world's cruelty and bitterness. My childhood did not prepare me for the fact that the world is full of cruel and bitter things, and physics, beautiful as it is, proved to be no insulation against them. I was wrong to believe, and I did believe this in the early years with an intensity that embarrasses me now, that understanding was the same as mastery, that knowing the laws of nature gave one some special authority over nature's consequences. It does not. The second law applies to the physicist as surely as it applies to the steam engine. We are not exempt. No one is exempt. But there is something in the second law, something that goes beyond the physics, beyond the thermodynamics, beyond the statistical mechanics, that I find, in my more honest moments, strangely comforting. And it is this. The second law tells us that nothing is free. Every increase in order, every creation of structure, every act of building or making or thinking requires energy, requires effort, requires the acceptance of a cost. The cost cannot be avoided. It cannot be deferred indefinitely. It cannot be wished away. And there is, I think, a kind of moral truth in this, a truth that applies not only to heat engines and refrigerators, but to the way we live, to the choices we make, to the things we build and the consequences we bear. Nothing is free. Every act of creation entails an act of destruction somewhere else. The burning of fuel, the expenditure of resources, the increase of entropy in the wider world. And to accept this, to accept it honestly, without resentment, without the fantasy of perpetual motion, is, I think, the beginning of a mature relationship with reality. When I was at Los Alamos, and I return to this not because I wish to dwell on it, but because it is where I learned certain things that I could not have learned elsewhere, I saw in the most vivid possible way the second law at work in the domain of human affairs. We created an extraordinary concentration of order, of knowledge, of talent, of organizational structure, of sheer intellectual power in a small town in the New Mexico mountains. And the purpose of all that order was to release energy on a scale that had never before been achieved, to convert a few kilograms of matter into the most violent and disordered state imaginable, a fireball at millions of degrees, a shock wave that would reduce a city to rubble and ash. Order to disorder. The most exquisitely organized intellectual effort in history, aimed at producing the most catastrophic increase in entropy ever accomplished by human beings. There is something in this that feels like a parable, not one I would have chosen, not one I find easy to tell, but one that seems in its terrible way to illustrate the moral dimension of the second law more clearly than any textbook example. Both the man of science and the man of action live always at the edge of mystery, surrounded by it. And the mystery of the second law, the deep mystery, the one that Boltzmann glimpsed and that we still do not fully understand, is the mystery of time itself. Why does time have a direction? Why do we remember the past and not the future? Why does a broken cup not reassemble itself, though the laws of mechanics, taken individually, would permit it? The answer, our best answer, the one that Boltzmann gave and that we have refined but not fundamentally altered, is that the universe began in a state of extraordinarily low entropy, a state of such extreme order that its probability, calculated using Boltzmann's formula, is so small that no number in ordinary experience can convey it. Roger Penrose, a mathematician of rare depth and creativity, someone I would have been proud to have at the Institute, estimated the probability at 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the 123rd. This is not a large number. This is a number that makes the number of atoms in the observable universe, roughly 10 to the 80th, look like a rounding error. And from this initial state of impossibly low entropy, the universe has been evolving, expanding, cooling, forming structures, creating galaxies and stars and planets and life, all of it driven, all of it sustained by the flow from low entropy to high, by the second law doing its patient, inexorable work. The Bhagavad Gita speaks of time as the ultimate force, kala, which is both time and death, which destroys all things, which creates the conditions for all things. When Krishna reveals his cosmic form to Arjuna, the Vishvarupa, the form of all forms, what Arjuna sees is not merely destruction, but the process of destruction, the flow of all beings into the mouths of time, like rivers flowing into the ocean. And I think sometimes, not as a physicist, but as a man who has read the Gita many times and has found in it consolations that physics cannot provide, that this vision is not so very far from what the second law describes in the language of mathematics. The flow of entropy, the direction of time, the dissolution of order into disorder. This is the cosmic form, seen not through the eyes of devotion, but through the equations of statistical mechanics. And it is, in its way, no less terrifying and no less beautiful. There are children playing in the streets who could solve some of my top problems in physics, because they have modes of sensory perception that I lost long ago. And I think sometimes that those children understand something about time, about loss, about the impossibility of going back, that we who study thermodynamics have merely formalized. They know, without being told, without needing Boltzmann's constant or Clausius's inequality, that the sandcastle will wash away, that the ice cream will melt, that summer will end. They do not yet know the mathematics, but they know the truth. I would not have you think that I regard the second law as merely grim. It is grim, in the way that all honest truths about the human condition are grim, if you look at them from a certain angle. But it is also, and I say this with the full weight of everything I have tried to describe, it is also the reason that anything interesting happens at all. If entropy did not increase, if the universe were at equilibrium, at maximum entropy, with no gradients, no flows, no differences between one region and another, then nothing would happen. There would be no motion, no change, no life, no thought, no science, no love, no grief, no music. The second law is the engine of the universe, not because it creates energy, but because it creates the flow of energy, the gradient from order to disorder that drives every process, every reaction, every thought that has ever occurred in the history of the cosmos. Without the second law, there would be no arrow of time. Without the arrow of time, there would be no us. And so the perpetual motion machine is not merely a technical impossibility. It is a philosophical one. It is the dream of a universe without consequence, without cost, without the passage of time. a universe in which one could have everything and pay for nothing, in which creation would not entail destruction, in which order would not require effort, and effort would not produce waste. It is, if I may say so, the dream of a child who has not yet learned that the world is full of cruel and bitter things, and also of beautiful things, of things that are beautiful precisely because they are temporary, because they cannot last, because the second law ensures that they will, in time, dissolve back into the disorder from which they briefly emerged. I said long ago that science is not everything, but science is very beautiful. I still believe this. The second law of thermodynamics, Clausius's formulation, Kelvin's formulation, Boltzmann's statistical foundation, the whole magnificent structure that connects the behavior of individual molecules to the fate of the universe, is among the most beautiful things I know. It is beautiful because it is true, because it does not flatter us, because it does not pretend that the universe is kinder than it is. And it is beautiful because, within its stern accounting of energy and entropy and the direction of time, there is room, there has always been room, for the improbable, the temporary, the achingly fragile structures of order that we call life and thought and love. These things do not last. The second law assures us of that. But they exist. They burn briefly against the dark, and their existence is not diminished by their impermanence. It is, if anything, made more precious. And if the perpetual motion machine is a dream of escaping time, then perhaps the wiser dream, the harder dream, the dream that requires not cleverness but courage, is the dream of living honestly within it, of building what we can build and accepting that it will not endure, of loving what we love and knowing that the entropy of the universe will, in the end, claim everything. This is not despair. This is clarity. And clarity, however painful, is always to be preferred to illusion, because it is only from clarity that anything real, anything true, anything worthy of the brief and extraordinary gift of consciousness can be built. The machine will stop. It always stops. The question is not how to make it run forever. The question is what we do with the time it runs.